Hello, everybody. It looks like everyone was able to come in. So I just wanted to say good morning. I guess afternoon, morning. So I'm in Mobile, Alabama. So I don't know what time it is there in Arizona, or if you're calling from anywhere else in the country or world. But I'm Dr. Dimberg. Really excited today to talk to you about some resilience. Just wanted you to be able to see my face before I hop on and switch to the presentation mode so you can see the slides. But this is me. Okay, hang tight. Let's get started. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Dimberg. I am the sports psychologist and mental skills coach out at Banner Sports Medicine Clinic in Scottsdale at the High Performance Center, which is a lovely view that you can see there. So what we're going to talk about today is we'll just give a brief intro as to what resilience is. We'll talk about the challenges in sport, different things that influence resilience, as well as how to build psychological resilience within sport. And then I'll just kind of share a little bit of information about who we are, Banner Sports Medicine Scottsdale, since we are still new and in our first year, in case you hadn't heard about us. Okay, so what is, you can hear my bracelet chiming. What is resilience? How we're going to define it today is that it's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties as well as learning to cope with stress, okay? So you can see here in the photo, kind of something's happening and able to like pause it, right? And kind of stop it before it continues on. So that's the idea of resiliency, is that you're able to recover quickly without it kind of persisting through and maybe even leading to further difficulties, okay? There are a couple of words that we'll go over that sometimes people use interchangeably with resilience, but they also have very specific definitions. So the first one here is mental toughness, and then we'll talk about hardiness, and then we'll talk about grit. So mental toughness is defined as the ability to perform under pressure, right? So sometimes you might have to be resilient and mentally tough, but resilience really talks about and speaks to a lot of other things, right? But that mental toughness aspect is the performing when there's pressure, okay? And then hardiness is the ability to endure difficult conditions with commitment, control, and challenge. And so the difference between resilience and hardiness is that it continues, right? There's maybe some persistent difficulties. You consistently have to be hardy and resilient, as well as that commitment piece. You have to work through being able to control and stay committed to getting through a difficult condition. And then the last one is going to be grit. I think this is kind of a buzzword in the last like at least 10 years, but how we'll define grit is being able to persevere and have passion for long-term goals that help someone overcome challenges. So the unique aspect of grit is that the connection to the long-term goals, right? That's really what's driving you to continue despite some of those challenges. That it's the long-term goals and you know that you want to do something, so then you continue on and having that grit based on what your goals are. So one thing I also wanted to make sure to touch on was that resilience does not equal perfection. I think sometimes people can think the two go hand in hand. So I just want to touch a little bit on some of the differences between those two. So resilience we think as being energizing, that maybe someone has really high standards, but they're able to kind of evaluate themselves and maybe others self-critically. And it's more of an adaptive pattern of motivation, right? So because of their standards, once they kind of evaluate themselves saying, okay, now I know what I need to shift, and this is what's driving me because I want to do better and I want to reach whatever that standard is. Versus perfectionist is fear driven, right? Oh my gosh, I don't want to fail. I don't want to make a mistake. Kind of that fear is driving it versus the standards and kind of feeling really energized from it, as well as maybe some irrational concerns, right? So within perfectionist, we tend to think about, they get kind of caught up within some of their thoughts, and sometimes it even kind of like spirals down, right? Almost like a rabbit hole, and getting really stuck in that. And then as well, perfectionist typically has really harsh self-deprecating evaluations of themselves. So not being self-critical and being able to, take the good and the bad and put it all together, but just kind of really harps on themselves or others. And then the last one is that it can be psychologically maladjusted, right? So having those really harsh standards and those irrational concerns can lead to them maybe even focusing in on those, which isn't very adaptive, right? And being able to stay motivated and work on their performance. It's really focused on that fear and just not wanting to maybe fail or make mistakes and things like that. So one thing also within resilience for an athlete, we're kind of getting into a little bit here. What are different things that might influence an athlete and it might have an impact on both their life challenges as well as resilience? So within psychology, this is called Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model, which is a fancy words, I should say, for different things that may impact an athlete, right? So you can see in the center there, it says individual. So I want you to think about whatever athlete drove you to attend this presentation today. Who is that individual, right? What's their gender? What's their age? Potentially SES. And then you take it one step out, and it's kind of the next layer of things that are connected to them, right? So where do they go to school? Who are their friends? Who are, I almost said coworkers, but I'm going to assume most people here are for student athletes. So maybe who are their teammates? Who is their immediate family, as well as maybe extended? Is there any religiosity or spirituality community that they're affiliated with? And how does that kind of influence who that individual is? And then further out as well would be the interactions between some of those within the microsystem. So how do the parents and coaches interact, right? How does the school and teammates interact if there is any interaction between them? And then the further one is people or things that maybe still have an influence, but they're kind of a few layers outside, right? So do they have any relationships with their neighbors? What is kind of the community that they physically live in? What does that look like? As well as different policies, social services, mass media, right? I think that is crucial in today's society. And I think that'll be our March talk is social media, but just touching on it quickly here. What are those messages that they're receiving and how does that influence them as an athlete, them as an individual and a person? And then last layer is kind of that macro system, right? So what might their values be? What are their attitudes towards just anything, right? So towards school, towards being a family member, towards being a teammate, how do they value and how do they want to be a part of whatever it is they're a part of, as well as larger society and the culture that they're a part of too. So talking a little bit about some challenges or difficulties that are really specific to sport, just broke it down really simply for the sake of time into personal, friend, family, and health, right? So again, if you're thinking about that ecological systems model that we just talked about and that athlete that's in the middle, who and what are their personal challenges or difficulties, right? Are they struggling in school? Are their grades kind of failing? Are they not understanding a subject? Are they not interested in a subject? What are other relationships, whether it be with teammates, with school peers, right? Things like that. Is there any competition, as well as with whatever organization they're a part of, right? I think in my experience, any type of team organization, whether it's military, sport, there tends to be some politics within organizations, right? And changes and difficulties that come up just with that alone. And how does that kind of trickle down into affecting the athlete? And how do they kind of persist and stay resilient despite or in addition to all of those things going on? And then the next challenge or difficulty within sport might be their friends, right? Maybe they're having some disagreements. I think particularly within the preteen kind of years, we see a lot of changes sometimes in friendships, and that can be a really big struggle for them, right? Maybe they had one person they felt like they really aligned with, and now that is kind of tangled and they're not really hanging out with them, or maybe not hearing back, and kind of confused about that and feeling kind of down. As well as maybe competing interests for time, right? So if someone is a part of a team, but they feel more strongly aligned with schoolmates, how does that kind of impact them, if at all, and become a challenge? As well as, are they friends with their teammates, right? And is there competing interest there? You want to do well as a team or even as an athlete, but if you're friends with either, a teammate or just someone that you're competing against, especially during high periods of competition time, what does that do for your friendship, right? So maybe it's a strong friendship outside of that, and during those periods, it can be kind of a challenge. And then the next one would be family. So if a family is going through divorce, right, how is that impacting the child? What are the changes that they're going through? How emotionally are they kind of handling that, as well as being relocated, even moving sometimes? And what's their relationship like with their siblings, right? We know siblings can have a lot of competition. Sometimes it can be really great and really thriving, just thinking of the Kelsey brothers right now. And other times, maybe it's a little bit more kind of tumultuous, right? So what does that do for the athlete as well? And then the last one, of course, is different injuries and illnesses, right? They're humans. We all are. And I hope to goodness that we never have a global pandemic again, but we know we saw that, right? And I think everyone can speak to how incredibly challenging that was. And within sport, the nuances that came with that too, right? Having to change practices or teams or where you could practice, or even sometimes in some cases not being able to participate in your sport, right? As well as injury, sometimes concussions, things like that as well. How do they maybe persist through some of those challenges or difficulties? So I also want to touch on the fact that someone may go through some of those challenges does not necessarily mean they're going to struggle, right? So there's this idea of post-traumatic growth that you can go through a challenging time and still be resilient. And how you can do that, and we'll get more specific here in a minute, but it's by doing two things really. So being able to recognize the possibilities that maybe come with that or that are still there despite or in addition to whatever it is going on, and taking some responsibility for choices, right? So talking about recognizing possibilities, say there is an injury and they can't run, right? Just being very general here. They have an injury and they can't run. Well, what are the possibilities with that? Okay, I'm not allowed or able to run right now, but I can walk, right? You could just stop there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that someone may grow within that. The next step would be making and following through with that choice, right? Okay, well, I know that because this is what I want to do, and connected to my long-term goals, again, bringing in some of that grit, I'm going to choose to walk. And recognizing that they do have that choice, because sometimes when those challenges can happen, what follows is they kind of just close off to everything. And I think the key for resilience, and if you can leave with taking away anything from this, is the idea of growth and possibility, in addition to whatever the challenges that they're encountering. So these are a few things based on research that have really driven resilience. So the 5 things are perceived social support, motivation, personality, focus, and confidence. So what I think is really, really crucial about that social support is that first word, right? So perceived. So I think sometimes as parents we may say like, oh my gosh, like I did not have enough time to check in with their sport. We were focused on school this week. But if the child feels, or if the athlete feels that support from you, guess what? That's enough. Or if they feel like, even if you didn't directly ask them, that they still feel supported. So if you're a coach, you're still there and kind of communicating and creating that environment that is supportive, that goes a long way into someone building that resilience. Additionally is motivation. So are they internally motivated? And we'll talk a little bit about that more on the next slide, as well as focus. But being able to have that drive themselves instead of being told you have to do this, right? So giving them choices and the opportunity to facilitate that for themselves is really important. The next one is personality. There are just certain personality traits that maybe lend toward an individual being more resilient, right? So we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide as well about different things that you can kind of help facilitate within that, even though we're not going to try and change someone's entire personality or make them a different person. Again, what are those things that you can say or do that are going to make the athlete really kind of focus on the growth, those possibilities, those choices, things like that. Staying focused, right? So are they focused on whatever it is that they want to get? So if you think back to that picture on the first slide, right, the little, I guess I was going to say stick figure, but I think there was more than that. So the little person that was kind of holding up those blocks, right, was, okay, I don't want this to then influence the rest of these things. So I'm going to stay really focused and hold this up so that I can get through this so that it doesn't impact the rest, and so that we can cope quickly and not kind of impact everything else. And then the last one is confidence, right? So are they confident, not just as an athlete, but are they confident in their abilities to cope, right? So often it's that people don't know what to do. I think especially for athletes, sports can be an incredible coping skill, an incredible outlet. Well, if there is an injury or if there is something else kind of going on that means it's, maybe when they're playing, they're thinking about what's going on at home, all those things that are influencing or challenging as an athlete is going to impact their ability to cope potentially. And so are they confident in knowing different things to do and then following through with doing those as well? And then lastly, we'll talk about what a parent or coach could do. I think I forgot to say this at the beginning. I'm so sorry. We're going to have 10 minutes of Q&A at the very end. So Callie's been going through that. So if you have any questions, or if you've had any questions, I guess, throughout, go ahead and pop those in. We'll be excited to answer any of those questions or even comments that you maybe want to share from the presentation. So how you can build and kind of foster resilience for an athlete. The first would be to focus on a facilitative response, right? So I talked a lot about growth and possibility. So the best way that you can do that would be to focus on what's called a growth mindset. And that will be our next month topic from HPC Virtual Education Series, where we really focus in on how and what a growth mindset is, as well as taking action, okay? So a little sneak peek of what growth mindset is that you're able to view possibilities differently and not kind of getting stuck, right? So again, I gave the example earlier of I can't run, right? That would kind of be a fixed mindset, just nope, I can't do anything, or I should say I can't do anything. And then the growth mindset part would be, well, I can't run, but I can walk now. So seeing that possibility instead of kind of being that black and white yes or no, finding different things that they can do, as well as then again, taking that action and following through with maybe the walk. And then the next one would be strong influences for resilience are going to be having experience in being able to practice those skills, right? So if they've been exposed to different challenges and then been really successful in using those skills, that's going to have a strong influence in any other type of area that they are working in or kind of participating in being able to stay resilient. And then if they're also committed and dedicated, right? So if the student athlete really loves what their sport and maybe they've been fortunate and haven't had to encounter any difficulties or challenges, kind of throughout the way, maintaining that commitment throughout. And then part of what you can do as a parent or coach, sometimes they might not identify something as a difficulty or struggle, but you've taken all of that in, right? So you kind of sharing with them, well, hey, this one time this happened, right? You missed that shot in that game, and you didn't feel great, but what did you do after, right? You went and you practiced even harder the next day. So those are things that you can kind of bring to light to kind of help build and recognize that resilience within the athlete to help them then recognize what that looks like for them. And then the next one would be social support, which we talked about, excuse me, a little bit earlier. So the perceived social support is what's really critical. And this might look like coming from coaches, right? So one thing that I've heard from certain organizations just throughout my life is that, if a kid makes a mistake in a game, the coach immediately pulls them out, right? So what does that teach the child? What does that tell the athlete? That you can't make a mistake, right? Versus, hey, this happened and you were able to come back from it, right? You kind of focused in, you locked in a little bit more. Things like that can really help and go a long way with being able to let the student know that it's okay to make a mistake or, fail at something and come out even better and stronger on the other side. The next one is going to be consistency. So both for the student or athlete being consistent in whatever their, coping skills look like, but as well as being consistent with their interest and their motivation with that sport, right? I think probably everyone on here can attest to maybe there's one day where it's like, man, I do not want to go to the gym today, right? How can you be consistent with that? How can you stay motivated during that time and thinking about what it is that you value? And again, that long-term goal can help them want to persist, right? And remain open to different things that they can do despite some of the challenges going on. Earlier in the last slide, we talked about some of the personality differences. So individuals that tend to be Open, conscientious, emotionally stable, as well as optimistic, tend to be more resilient, right? So for something that a parent or coach could do is help them be creative, help them remain optimistic. And I don't mean optimistic in everything's fine or it's okay, right? Sometimes being realist can also be optimistic. It's yes and focusing on additional things. And that optimism part I really want you to take away is the growth, right? So even though something like this happened, what could that growth look like? What are other things that you could maybe do, right? So that open part, maybe if the kid is or athlete is really stuck in, oh my gosh, I can't do anything at all, give them some options, right? Also important though, for emotionally stable, we gotta feel that emotion, right? So not necessarily trying to like shove it away and say, oh, we don't want to feel bad or we don't want to feel worried or anxious or something, but kind of honoring and acknowledging that and then moving forward as well, right? That you can feel anxious or you can be upset, and how can we move forward with this, okay? And then for self-motivated, for the individual or athlete that maybe is motivated by themselves, right? They really love this, they have that internal drive, and then the self-determined is extrinsic. So they're receiving messages from others, for increasing that motivation. I would say focus on building that internal motivation. Are there little messages that you can give to that individual that focus on who they are as a person and kind of building them up instead of kind of always criticizing or always pointing out some of the like failures or difficulties maybe that they're having, but also acknowledging some of those really great aspects to help build in that internal motivation. We talked a lot about confidence in the last slide. So not just being confident in themselves as an athlete, but also being confident in their ability to use those skills. And then the next one would be compartmentalization and that focus from those 5 aspects that research shows kind of influence resilience. So say they are, their family is unfortunately going through a divorce. How does that impact them on the field? Are they able to say, okay, now is my time to like turn that off and really focus in, get locked in. And then I know when I come off the field, it's still there, right? I'm not trying to shove it away or not pay attention to it. But for right now, I'm shifting my focus to like get this done, right? Which can be a skill in learning how to do. And sometimes depending on whatever the challenge or difficulty is, it might be a little bit easier than not to do, but that doesn't mean that you can't practice it and do it. And again, that perceived social support is really crucial. Excuse me. So one other thing that I think is really important for parents and coaches to recognize, or anyone else that may be on the call, is that it doesn't just have to be about the athlete, right? That you as the adults or individuals in this athlete's life have so much influence, right? So you're going to make mistakes as a coach. You're going to make mistakes as a parent, right? How are you resilient? How are you modeling that resilience for them? How are you modeling that, man, I had a challenging day at work, right? And what are your coping skills? What are they witnessing and how are you making that a part of the conversation? Because even though the two might not seem connected, they're taking that information in, right? And they're going to be using that to then inform how they handle situations in the future as well. So if you, both coaches, parents, whoever, if you also were an athlete, talk about times that you made mistakes and how you overcame those, right? I think oftentimes we don't, excuse me, allergies from traveling. I think sometimes we don't tend to give those examples as much, and it can be hard to think about, oh my gosh, what happened when I was an athlete, right? Back when I was a kid. But thinking through different ones can be really helpful in having those shared and how you coped with them, whether it's good or bad, right? Say, oh my gosh, I did not cope well with that. Sharing that with them, if it's appropriate, and what you would do differently, right? And why you would do things differently, I think can go a really long way into influencing and building resilience into a child, having it modeled for them, making those conversations a part of it, having them just feel supported in whatever capacity, and fostering that growth can all really, really help resilience. So we have a few minutes for questions now. Before we jump to that, I just want to talk on the High Performance Center and what we do in case you haven't heard of us. We do different testing and evaluation, so movement efficiency and range of motion, as well as biomechanics, as well as sports med services, injury prevention, performance training, skill development, recovery and regen. As I mentioned, I'm the sports psychologist and mental skills coach, so I do that out at the Banner Sports Medicine. And then we also have a dietitian now who does performance nutrition. Callie, was there anything else that I missed for that, or are we ready for some questions? Hopefully we got a couple. So sorry I added that on late.
Nothing from my end, so we'll take a look at a couple of questions here.
Perfect. Do we have questions, Callie?
I've got one that popped up. Ben's asking, can we get a copy of this recording?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben. I know that we are recording it. And so we're still figuring out how we're going to navigate that. But if that is something that you'd like, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to make that work. I think we might be adding it to our website. We're going to be continuing doing these on different topics as well. I know our performance nutrition is about to kick off her series. I'm really excited for that. So there's definitely going to be more, and we're happy to get you a copy of that. Sure. Is it Connell? Feel free to pop it in there since I don't see it. I see one here. It says, I'm not sure if everyone can see the chat, so I'll just read it. But I have a teen athlete who has always struggled with focusing on failure and does not see his successes. I have suggested meeting with sports psychologists, and he is very against the idea. Any tips on getting our kiddos more receptive to the idea of a mental coach? Man, that is such a good question. I like to think that we've really reduced the stigma, but as you're suggesting as well, is that there is still kind of a stigma. And so I would say, to start, what are the messages that they're receiving from either yourself, their coaches, their friends on mental skills? Kind of checking the pulse to see what their organization, whatever they're a part of, what they're kind of promoting, because that could be a part of it. If they're hearing, you don't need that or anything like that, that could be driving that influence to not be interested. So finding out what they've heard about it, what do they know? And then something that I also find really helpful is there are tons of media posts now with high level professional athletes and really elite athletes talking about being able to use these skills and how they use mental performance coaches and things like that. So I think also adding some of the people they really look up to and how it helped them might be another good start. No, unfortunately, Deanna, there are not CEUs available for this chat, but maybe in the future that's something that we can definitely add. I recognize that we only have less than a minute left, but I see one more question here. I am a believer in our ability as parents to kill or fuel the joy our kids have in sports based on the questions we ask on the car ride home. Absolutely. Do you have any go-to question prompts that you use with our kids to debrief their training games? I have a few, but would love to learn from you or the crowd. Yeah, absolutely. So this will be the last question that I answer for the sake of time, but I think a couple things that you could ask, right? Training or games. Yep, absolutely. So even just being there, right? You don't have to have a specific question. Kind of let them drive with whatever it is that they're sharing, or even just saying, how are you feeling? Right? I think sometimes parents kind of hone in on something that happened in either the training or the game, or, oh, I noticed this. Or sometimes the kid says, oh, I really messed up this goal, right? Or whatever kind of sport or terminology you want to use. How can you just sit with that and kind of let them kind of, explore that and kind of share without focusing too much on it, if that makes sense. And I think it's hard to answer in the time that we have, but, just creating that environment that just lets them share, right? So you don't even have to have a really specific question to focus in on anything. But if they do bring something up, how can you facilitate it in a growth way, right? If they're kind of emotional and maybe tearing up or really frustrated, that might not be the time to be rational and throw in some choices or things that they could do differently. But maybe when they come down from that and they're kind of in a calmer state, bringing in, again, that growth, what can you do differently? How are you going to do practice today, knowing that, you just brought up XYZ? Okay. Yes, avoid outcome-based questions. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, everybody. Well, we're going to stop I see, Rebecca, that you asked a question. I'm so sorry we didn't have time to get to it today, but feel free to reach out to us or email me, and I'm happy to answer it at that time. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming in. Really excited. We're going to continue having these once a month. And as I mentioned, we're going to start the performance nutrition one as well. And hopefully we can get some additional topics too. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.